Thank you, Deputy Speaker. And Deputy Speaker, it's a privilege to be able to speak on this motion. I thank the member for Menzies for moving it. As we know, throughout human history, there have been mass human and cultural genocides throughout history and often targeted at minority groups within predominant or dominant cultural communities. Of course, with my own Armenian heritage, we have a legacy that was our first Anzacs, as they bore witness on their arrival into Gallipoli, saw the human consequences of the Armenian genocide. Representing the third largest Jewish community in Australia, or having the third largest Jewish community in Australia in Goldstein, I'm very familiar with the ongoing memory and legacy of the Holocaust. But we need to remember that in remembering genocides, it is part of the journey of stopping them into the future. And as I said right at the start, genocide doesn't just involve a human dimension, though that is critical. It can also involve a cultural dimension around erasing the memory, the traditions, the culture and the values that underpin societies. And in Xinjiang, the Chinese Communist Party is engaging in a form of cultural genocide against the Uyghur people. It's that simple. The vicious and inhumane tragedy occurring in that province due to the actions of the CCP makes for difficult reading for anybody who is interested. An investigation by the Associated Press has revealed the CCP is regularly subjecting hundreds of thousands of Uyghur women to forced sterilisation and abortions to lose the next generation. A report by the Australian Institute of International Affairs published last year describes how the CCP is seeking to erode and redefine the culture of the Uyghurs, not just erase their memory and their traditions, but what they can then hand on to future generations as well. This has involved the destruction of 16,000 mosques in Xinjiang since 2017. Another report by ASPI details how between 2017 and 2019, over 80,000 Uyghurs were forcibly transferred to labour camps for ideological brainwashing on an industrial scale. The United Nations Genocide Convention establishes that genocide does not necessarily require the immediate mass destruction of a group. The elimination of a people can occur in a number of ways, including those documented in the growing volume of Xinjiang investigations and reports. What is critical, though, is the intent about whether there is an action being taken to remove the memory, the legacy and the future of a people. To me, that is quite clear that that is the intent in the case of the Uyghurs. The atrocities in Xinjiang are being implemented at the direction of the Chinese Communist Party with the specific intent of destroying the Uyghurs as a separate cultural and political grouping within China. ASPI has described this as an agenda to render them subservient to the Chinese nation. These events serve as another reminder that when political systems seek to enforce rather than earn their legitimacy, the end result will be a human tragedy and suffering for those today and, of course, for those in the future. The CCP asserts its legitimacy by claiming a Han-centric unified China has existed continuously for 5,000 years with broad consent and cooperation. The CCP argues its responsibility to continue this tradition to ensure stability and prosperity in China. It's something that many people would question, whether they're those of Tibet, the good people of Hong Kong, and of course potentially other territories into the future. It's a narrative that's particularly difficult to reconcile with the vastly different lived experience of minority communities throughout China and Xinjiang in particular. Xinjiang was first subject to Chinese political authority as a result of the mid-18th century and has witnessed significant periods of independent self-government while under Chinese rule. Atrocities are incapable of respecting differences and spontaneous associations among free people because they depend on the centricity of the state and lives of the citizens and a rigid national image imposed from above, a classic reminder of the horrors of communism, but particularly centralised authority, and that it's the job of the people to conform, not, of course, for the government to reflect their people. What we see is the merciless indulgence of a political elite who consider the separate identity of the Uyghurs as a threat to the Han-centric image of China. These events are not an anomaly. In Hong Kong, of course, we've seen the CCP build its sovereignty on oppression rather than cooperation and consent, including through the flood of people. The CCP's response to protests against extradition law has seen police violence, attacks on the media, the imprisonment of 47 democracy activists, and of course the removal of local elections, and now people only who are conforming to Beijing's will are even allowed to stand for office. For the good of humanity, it is the responsibility of free democracies and the international community to unreservedly call these events out, to call for an investigation, because free countries promote secure society, human liberty as the biggest proponent of peace. I thank you, Deputy Speaker.